Have you ever stood next to a giraffe and felt absolutely tiny? Well, imagine that feeling multiplied by about 10,000. Picture creatures so massive that their necks alone stretched longer than school buses, with bodies that could crush cars without even noticing. These weren't mythical beasts from fantasy novels or Hollywood blockbusters. These were real animals that walked our planet for over 100 million years. And they represent some of the most mind-blowing examples of evolution in action. We're talking about sauropods, and honestly, these things were so ridiculously huge that they make every other land animal look like a house pet. But here's what absolutely blows my mind about these giants. They didn't just pop up out of nowhere as massive titans. No, they started small, and through millions of years of evolution, they transformed into the largest creatures that have ever walked on land. Ever. I'm talking about animals that weighed as much as 12 elephants put together. Animals whose hearts alone were the size of small cars. Animals that had to develop entirely new ways of living just to support their incredible bulk. And the craziest part? We're going to trace their entire evolutionary journey from tiny two-legged creatures that you could probably hold in your arms to behemoths that would make a Boeing 737 look compact. By the end of this series, you're going to understand exactly how these incredible animals came to dominate the ancient world, why they got so impossibly large, and how they managed to thrive for longer than any other group of large land animals in Earth's history. We're going to explore the fossil evidence, the evolutionary pressures, and the anatomical innovations that made these giants possible. Trust me, this story is way more fascinating than anything you learned about dinosaurs in elementary school. But before we dive into the epic tale of how tiny dinosaurs became walking skyscrapers, we need to set the stage. We need to go back to a time when dinosaurs were just getting started, when the world looked completely different, and when the ancestors of these future giants were nothing more than small, nimble creatures trying to survive in a dangerous world. So let's rewind the clock about 230 million years and travel back to the late Triassic period. This is where our story begins. In a world that would be almost unrecognizable to us today, the continents were still mashed together in a supercontinent called Pangaea. The climate was hot and humid everywhere, and the first dinosaurs were just beginning to make their mark on the planet. Now, here's where things get really interesting. The very first sauropod ancestors weren't giants at all. In fact, they were surprisingly small and walked on two legs, just like many of the meat-eating dinosaurs we're familiar with. These early pioneers belonged to a group called sauropodomorphs, and if you saw one in person, you'd probably mistake it for a completely different type of dinosaur altogether. Picture this. You're walking through a late Triassic forest, and you spot what looks like a small theropod dinosaur darting between the ferns. It's about 8 feet long, stands upright on its hind legs, and moves with quick, agile steps. You might think you're looking at an early relative of Velociraptor or some other predatory dinosaur. But you'd be wrong. What you're actually seeing is one of the earliest members of the lineage that would eventually produce the largest land animals of all time. These early sauropodomorphs had some telltale features that hinted at their future destiny. even though they were still tiny by sauropod standards. Their heads were proportionally smaller compared to their bodies than other dinosaurs of the time. Their necks were noticeably longer than those of their contemporaries. And here's a crucial detail that paleontologists used to identify them. Their teeth were shaped like leaves and had multiple small projections along the edges, perfect for processing plant material. But here's what's really wild about these early forms. Even though they had teeth designed for eating plants, they weren't strict vegetarians yet. These pioneering sauropodomorphs were actually omnivores, munching on whatever they could find, whether it was leaves, fruits, insects, or small animals. They were opportunistic feeders, taking advantage of any available food source in their environment. Some of the earliest members of this group had names like Saturnalia, Panphagia, and Eoraptor. And get this, Eoraptor was actually misidentified for years. Scientists initially thought it was an early meat-eating dinosaur because of its size and posture. It wasn't until much later that researchers realized this little guy was actually one of the foundational members of the group that would eventually produce Brontosaurus and its massive relatives. But what really sets these early sauropodomorphs apart from other dinosaurs isn't just their teeth or their proportions. It's something much more subtle but incredibly important for their future evolution. These dinosaurs had what scientists call a wraparound overbite. Basically, when they close their mouths, their lower teeth fit completely inside their upper teeth. This might seem like a minor detail, but this dental arrangement would become crucial as these animals evolved to process larger and larger quantities of plant material. Now, as the Triassic period progressed, something remarkable started happening to the global climate and environment. The world became increasingly wet and humid, creating perfect conditions for plant life to explode in diversity and abundance. Forests became denser, ferns grew taller, and new types of vegetation began spreading across the landscape. This botanical boom created incredible opportunities for any animal that could take advantage of all this new plant material. And that's exactly what the sauropodomorphs did. With so much vegetation available, especially in high places that other animals couldn't reach, these early dinosaurs began to specialize more and more in plant consumption. They started to ditch their omnivorous habits and focus primarily on browsing. This shift in diet would prove to be one of the most important evolutionary decisions in the history of life on land. As these animals became more committed to plant eating, they began to face new challenges and opportunities. Plants are much harder to digest than meat, so you need to consume huge quantities to get enough nutrition. Plants in high places offer less competition from other herbivores, but you need to be tall enough to reach them. And plants don't run away, so you don't need to be as fast or agile as predators. But you do need better defenses against the predators that want to eat you. All of these pressures began to push sauropodomorphs in a very specific evolutionary direction: bigger, taller, and more heavily built. This transition marks the beginning of one of the most dramatic size increases in the history of animal evolution. We're talking about creatures that would grow from 8-foot-long bipeds to 100-foot-long quadrupeds in a relatively short geological time span. The first major step in this transformation led to a group called prosauropods. These were the intermediate forms, the stepping stones between the small early sauropodomorphs and the true giants that would come later. Prosauropods were much larger than their predecessors, with some species reaching lengths of over 30 feet and weights of several tons. They were the largest animals in their ecosystems, towering over everything else around them. But prosauropods were still transitional creatures, caught between two different ways of life. Many of them could still rear up on their hind legs when they needed to, using their long necks to reach high vegetation or their size to intimidate predators. Their front limbs still retained grasping abilities, with fingers that could manipulate objects or hold onto branches while feeding. They were like evolutionary experiments, testing out different combinations of features that would eventually be refined in later sauropods. Some prosauropods, like Apatosaurus, give us a perfect snapshot of this transitional phase. Apatosaurus was a hefty animal, weighing as much as a large elephant, but it still moved primarily on its hind legs. Its center of gravity had shifted forward compared to earlier forms, making it more stable when reaching for high vegetation, but it hadn't yet committed fully to a four-legged lifestyle. Other prosauropods were already experimenting with walking on all fours. Species like Rheosaurus showed clear signs of spending most of their time in a quadrupedal position, with their limb proportions and bone structure adapted for supporting their weight on 4 legs rather than 2. These animals were essentially testing out the body plan that would become standard for all later sauropods. As the Triassic period drew to a close and the Jurassic period began, prosauropods continued to evolve and diversify. They developed longer necks, smaller heads relative to their body size, and increasingly robust limb bones to support their growing bulk. Some species even began to develop small cheeks, which would help them process plant material more efficiently by keeping food in their mouths while they chewed. But perhaps the most important innovation during this time was the gradual shift from bipedalism to quadrupedalism. This wasn't a sudden change, but rather a gradual transition that happened over millions of years. As these animals got larger and heavier, walking on 2 legs became increasingly impractical. Their center of gravity shifted forward, making it harder to balance upright. Their necks got longer and heavier, adding even more weight to the front of their bodies. Eventually, it became more efficient for these animals to support their weight on all 4 limbs rather than trying to balance everything on just their hind legs. This transition to quadrupedalism was absolutely crucial for the evolution of truly gigantic sauropods. Walking on 4 legs provides a much more stable platform for supporting massive body weight and allows for much larger overall body sizes than bipedalism ever could. By the end of the Triassic period, some prosauropods were looking remarkably similar to true sauropods. Animals like Melanosaurus from South Africa were so sauropod-like that paleontologists still debate whether they should be classified as advanced prosauropods or early sauropods. The line between these two groups had become increasingly blurry as evolution pushed these animals toward their ultimate gigantic form. And then finally, the the first true sauropods appeared in the fossil record, these weren't just bigger prosauropods. They represented a fundamentally new type of animal, with body plans and lifestyles that were unlike anything that had come before. They had committed fully to quadrupedalism, with limb bones that looked like massive columns designed solely for supporting incredible weight. They had developed new feeding strategies that allowed them to process enormous quantities of plant material quickly and efficiently. But even identifying the very first sauropods is a matter of ongoing scientific debate. Some researchers point to animals like Allosaurus, which lived about 228 million years ago, as among the earliest true sauropods. These creatures still retain some primitive features like digits with grasping capabilities, but they also showed clear sauropod characteristics like extremely robust limb bones and proportions adapted for supporting massive weight. Other scientists argue that these early forms are still too primitive to be considered true sauropods and should be classified as advanced sauropodomorphs instead. The debate highlights just how gradual and continuous the evolutionary transition was from small bipedal ancestors to gigantic quadrupedal descendants. Evolution doesn't work in neat categories, and the boundaries between different groups of animals are often much more fluid than our classification system suggests. What's not debatable, however, is that by the early Jurassic period, unmistakable sauropods were walking the earth. These early giants had already begun to develop the key innovations that would allow their descendants to reach truly astronomical sizes. They had evolved new tooth shapes and jaw mechanics for more efficient plant processing. They had developed air sacs in their bones to reduce weight without sacrificing strength. They had perfected the quadrupedal stance that would serve as the foundation for all future size increases. But this is just the beginning of our story. These early sauropods, impressive as they were still relatively modest compared to what was coming. The real explosion in sauropod diversity and size was yet to come during the Middle and Late Jurassic period, when these animals would undergo one of the most spectacular evolutionary radiations in the history of life on Earth. What happened next in sauropod evolution is honestly one of the most incredible stories in the entire history of life on our planet. We're talking about an evolutionary explosion that produced some of the most bizarre, magnificent, and downright unbelievable creatures that have ever existed. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that what these animals accomplished defied every rule we thought we knew about how large land animals could possibly get. So, we've established that the first true sauropods had appeared by the early Jurassic period, and they were already pretty impressive animals. But here's where things get absolutely wild. These early sauropods weren't content to just stay at their current size. No, evolution had much bigger plans for them. Much bigger plans. The transition from early sauropods to the true giants happened through a group called Gravasauria, and even their name tells you everything you need to know. These were the heavy lizards, and they represent a major leap forward in sauropod evolution. The Gravasaurians made some crucial anatomical changes that would set the stage for everything that came after. First, they completely redesigned their feeding apparatus. Remember those leaf-shaped teeth with all the little projections that we talked about earlier? Well, the Gravisaurians ditched those entirely. Instead, they evolved teeth that were shaped more like spoons, smooth-edged and perfectly designed for a completely new way of eating. Their jaws could open much wider than their predecessors, and they lost those fleshy cheeks that earlier forms had developed. Now, why would they make these changes? Because they had discovered something revolutionary: bulk feeding. Instead of carefully chewing their food like earlier sauropodomorphs, these animals developed the ability to bite off massive quantities of vegetation and swallow it whole. No processing, no careful chewing, just grab huge mouthfuls of plants and gulp them down as fast as possible. This might sound like a step backward in terms of efficiency, but it was actually a stroke of evolutionary genius. By eliminating the time-consuming process of chewing, these animals could consume absolutely enormous quantities of food in a relatively short period. And when you're trying to fuel a body that weighs several tons, speed of consumption becomes incredibly important. But the feeding changes were just the beginning. Gravisaurians also completely redesigned their limb structure. Gone were the flexible arms and legs of their ancestors with their grasping digits and multi-purpose joints. Instead, these animals evolved limbs that looked like massive stone columns, rigid and incredibly strong, but specialized entirely for one purpose: supporting tremendous weight. This transition to column-like limbs was absolutely crucial for what came next. You simply cannot build a truly gigantic land animal without this type of limb structure. The physics just don't work. But with these pillar-like legs acting as biological support beams, sauropods were ready to push the boundaries of terrestrial animal size like nothing before or since. Following the Gravisaurians came an even more advanced group called Eusauropoda, the true sauropods. And this is where things start getting really spectacular. These animals continued the trend toward gigantism, but also began diversifying into an incredible array of different forms, each adapted for slightly different lifestyles and environments. Eusauropods perfected the art of extreme neck elongation. We're talking about necks that stretched over 40 feet in some species, longer than most buildings are tall. But here's what's really mind-blowing about these necks. They weren't just stretched-out versions of normal necks. They were engineering marvels filled with air sacs that made them incredibly lightweight for their size and supported by complex systems of muscles and ligaments that allowed precise control over their movement. For decades, scientists debated how these animals held their necks. Some argued they must have carried them horizontally, like a suspension bridge, because holding such massive necks upright would be impossible. Others insisted they held them vertically, like giraffes on steroids. Recent research suggests the vertical position was correct, which honestly makes these animals even more impressive. Imagine the cardiovascular system required to pump blood all the way up a 40-foot neck to reach the brain. But neck length was just one of many innovations these animals developed. Some early sauropods, like Shunnosaurus from China, had weaponized tails tipped with massive clubs covered in spikes. Picture a creature the size of a city bus with a tail that ends in what basically amounts to a medieval mace. And you'll start to get an idea of just how incredible these animals were. Others, like Spinosaurus from Africa, combined long necks with defensive tail weapons, creating animals that were simultaneously specialized for high browsing and equipped for serious combat. These weren't just gentle giants peacefully munching leaves. These were animals that could defend themselves against some of the most formidable predators that ever lived. As the Jurassic period progressed, sauropod evolution really hit its stride. The group underwent what scientists call an adaptive radiation, rapidly diversifying into dozens of different species, each exploring different ways to be a successful giant herbivore. This explosion of diversity led to the emergence of Neosauropoda, the new sauropods, and this is where we start seeing the animals that really capture our imagination. Neosauropods developed some fascinating new features that made them even more efficient at their chosen lifestyle. They concentrated their teeth at the front of their mouths, creating what were essentially biological hedge trimmers, perfectly designed for cropping vegetation. They enlarged their nasal regions dramatically, possibly for better smell detection or more efficient air processing in their massive respiratory systems. But the real excitement came when Neosauropoda split into two major evolutionary branches, each taking a different approach to the challenge of being a gigantic plant eater. This split happened during the Middle Jurassic period and led to two distinct lineages that would dominate different ecological niches for the rest of the Mesozoic era. The first branch was called Macedonia, which literally means big noses. And boy, did these animals live up to their name. Macronarians had enormously enlarged nasal openings and distinctive crests on top of their skulls. Some scientists think these enlarged nasal structures might have been used for thermoregulation, helping these massive animals manage their body temperature in hot climates. The most famous early macronarian is probably Camarasaurus, which shared the late Jurassic landscape with some of the most famous dinosaurs of all time. But Camarasaurus was just the beginning. This lineage would eventually produce the Titanosauriforms, a group that includes some of the most spectacular sauropods ever discovered. Titanosauriforms took the big nose concept even further, developing massive snouts with prominent ridges and crests. But more importantly, they perfected the art of extreme neck elongation. Some members of this group had necks that made up more than half their total body length, allowing them to browse vegetation at heights that no other land animal could possibly reach. Within Titanosauriforms, we find the Brachiosauridae, and these animals represent perhaps the most iconic image most people have of sauropods. Brachiosaurus, with its incredibly long front legs and towering posture, looked like something out of a fantasy novel. These animals stood as tall as four-story buildings and could reach vegetation nearly 60 feet off the ground. But Brachiosaurus was just one member of a diverse family. Other brachiosaurids explored different approaches to the high-browsing lifestyle, some developing even longer necks, others focusing on more robust body construction. Each species was fine-tuned for slightly different environmental conditions and food sources. The brachiosaurids shared their world with an incredible diversity of other sauropods, creating ecosystems unlike anything we see today. Imagine walking through a late Jurassic forest and encountering not just one type of giant herbivore, but dozens of different species, each specialized for feeding at different heights and on different types of vegetation. The level of niche partitioning among these animals was absolutely extraordinary. But brachiosaurids weren't the only successful titanosauriforms. The group also produced the Symphospondyle, which included some incredibly long-necked forms, and eventually gave rise to the Titanosauria, which would become the most successful and diverse group of sauropods in the Cretaceous period. Titanosaurs represent the ultimate expression of sauropod evolution. These animals pushed the boundaries of terrestrial body size to their absolute limits and beyond. We're talking about creatures like Argentinosaurus and Apatosaurus, animals that may have weighed over 70 tons and stretched over 100 feet from nose to tail. To put that in perspective, these animals were longer than blue whales and potentially heavier than any animal that has ever lived. But titanosaurs weren't just about size. They were also incredibly diverse and innovative. Some species developed armor plating along their backs, turning themselves into living tanks. Others evolved unusual proportions, with some having extremely long necks, while others developed more compact builds. The group successfully colonized virtually every continent and adapted to an enormous range of different environments. The success of titanosaurs is particularly impressive when you consider that they lived during the Cretaceous period, a time when the world was changing rapidly. Flowering plants were revolutionizing terrestrial ecosystems, new types of predators were evolving, and continental positions were shifting dramatically. Yet, titanosaurs not only survived these changes, but thrived, becoming more diverse and widespread than sauropods had ever been before. Some of the last titanosaurs, like Allosaurus, were still around right up until the end of Cretaceous extinction event 66 million years ago. These animals shared their final world with Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops, representing the culmination of over 160 million years of sauropod evolution. But we haven't talked about the other major branch of Neosauropoda yet, and trust me, this group is every bit as fascinating as the Macronarians. This second lineage took a completely different approach to being a successful giant herbivore, and their innovations were just as remarkable in their own way. This brings us to Diplodocus, a group that included some of the most unusual and specialized sauropods that ever lived. While the Macronarians were focusing on reaching higher and higher vegetation, the Diplodocus were perfecting the art of ground-level browsing and developing some of the most sophisticated feeding strategies in the entire sauropod lineage. The Diplodocus were absolutely revolutionary in their approach to being massive herbivores. And honestly, they developed some of the coolest adaptations in the entire dinosaur family tree. These animals took one look at the arms race for reaching higher vegetation and said, "You know what? We're going to dominate the low-level browsing game instead." And dominate they did. The first thing that made Diplodocus special was their body proportions. While their Macronarian cousins were developing longer front legs to reach higher, Diplodocus went in the opposite direction. They had relatively shorter front limbs compared to their hind limbs, giving them a distinctive sloped profile that was perfectly adapted for feeding on ground level and low-growing vegetation. But here's where things get really interesting. Diplodocoids didn't just settle for being ground-level feeders. They developed some of the most sophisticated skull and dental adaptations we've ever seen in herbivorous dinosaurs. Their heads became incredibly elongated and narrow, almost horse-like in their proportions, but with a twist that would make any engineer jealous. These animals evolved what scientists call pencil-shaped teeth, and the name is incredibly accurate. Picture a row of thin, cylindrical pegs lining the front of their mouths, perfectly designed for stripping leaves and soft vegetation. But here's the really clever part. These teeth were positioned only at the very front of their jaws, creating what was essentially a biological hedge trimmer. This dental arrangement allowed diplodocoids to be incredibly selective about what they ate. They could carefully strip the most nutritious parts of plants while leaving behind the tough, woody material that was harder to digest. It was like having a built-in salad bar where you could pick and choose only the best bits. The group split into two major families, and each one pushed these innovations in slightly different directions. The first family, Dicraeosauridae, were the more conservative branch, but conservative is definitely a relative term when we're talking about 40-foot-long dinosaurs with necks that could reach over trees. Dicraeosaurids had relatively shorter necks compared to other diplodocoids, which might sound like a limitation, but it was actually a brilliant specialization. These animals focused on mid-level browsing, targeting vegetation that was too high for ground-dwelling herbivores, but too low for the super long-necked giants. They filled a perfect ecological niche between the forest floor and the canopy. Some dicraeosaurids, like Amargasaurus, developed absolutely spectacular adaptations. Picture a sauropod with a row of tall parallel spines running along its neck and back, possibly supporting skin membranes that could be used for display or thermoregulation. These animals looked like something out of a science fiction movie, with decorative features that would make a peacock jealous. But the real stars of the Diplodocoid show were the Diplodocidae, and these animals represent some of the most extreme adaptations in all of sauropod evolution. When most people think of long-necked dinosaurs, they're probably picturing a diplodocid, even if they don't know it. Diplodocids took neck elongation to absolutely ridiculous extremes. We're talking about animals whose necks alone stretched over 25 feet, supported by incredibly complex systems of muscles, ligaments, and air-filled bones. But unlike the macronarians, who used their long necks primarily for reaching high vegetation, diplodocids had a different strategy entirely. These animals could use their incredibly flexible necks like massive vacuum cleaners, sweeping them back and forth across the ground to strip vegetation over enormous areas without having to move their bodies. Imagine a creature that could stand in one spot and clear every edible plant within a 50-foot radius just by moving its head around. That's the kind of feeding efficiency we're talking about. The most famous diplodocid is probably Diplodocus itself, an animal that perfectly embodies everything spectacular about this group. Diplodocus stretched over 80 feet from nose to tail, but despite its enormous length, it was actually relatively lightweight for a sauropod. The secret was in its construction: hollow bones filled with air sacs, elongated proportions that distributed weight efficiently, and a body plan that prioritized reach and flexibility over raw bulk. But even Diplodocus wasn't the most famous member of its family. That honor goes to an animal that's been at the center of one of paleontology's most entertaining controversies: Brontosaurus. For decades, scientists argued about whether Brontosaurus was actually a separate species or just another name for Apatosaurus. The debate got so heated that it became known as the Bone Wars, and it involved everything from academic rivalry to outright fossil theft. The resolution? Well, it turns out both sides were partially right. Recent research has confirmed that Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus are indeed separate animals, though they're very closely related. Brontosaurus was slightly more robust and had different skull proportions, but both animals shared the same basic body plan and lifestyle. And what a lifestyle it was! These animals had some of the most remarkable tails in the entire animal kingdom. Diplodocid tails were incredibly long and ended in a thin, whip-like section that could be moved at tremendous speeds. Some researchers have calculated that these tails could actually break the sound barrier when snapped, creating literal sonic booms. Just think about that for a moment. We're talking about animals that could weaponize sound itself, using their tails like biological whips to create thundercrack noises that could be heard for miles. Whether they use this ability for defense, communication, or just showing off, we'll probably never know for sure, but the physics definitely work out. The other major branch of diplodocoids was even more specialized and, frankly, even weirder. The Rebbachisauridae took the concept of selective feeding to its absolute extreme, developing some of the most unusual skull adaptations we've ever seen in herbivorous dinosaurs. Rebbachisaurids had faces that pointed straight down, almost like they were perpetually looking at the ground. Their snouts were broad and flared out at the front, and their teeth were arranged in a distinctive pattern that created what was essentially a biological lawnmower. These animals were perfectly adapted for processing low-growing vegetation, ferns, and ground cover. The most extreme example of Rebbachisaurids specialization was an animal called Nigersaurus, and this creature had one of the most bizarre skulls in the entire fossil record. Nigersaurus had over 500 tiny teeth arranged in multiple rows across its broad, flat snout. As teeth wore out from constant use, new ones would replace them from behind, creating a continuously self-sharpening feeding apparatus. This dental arrangement was so unusual that when paleontologists first discovered Nigersaurus fossils, they couldn't figure out how the skull was supposed to fit together. It looked like no other dinosaur skull they'd ever seen, with proportions that seemed almost impossible for a living animal. It wasn't until they found more complete specimens that they realized they were looking at perhaps the most specialized herbivore that ever lived. Nigersaurus could process vegetation at ground level with incredible efficiency, essentially mowing down entire patches of ferns and low-growing plants as it walked through late Cretaceous forests. Its feeding strategy was so specialized that it probably couldn't lift its head more than a few feet off the ground. But within its chosen niche, it was absolutely dominant. The success of diplodocoids shows us something really important about sauropod evolution. These animals didn't just get bigger and bigger in a straight line. Instead, they diversified into an incredible array of different forms, each perfectly adapted for different feeding strategies and environmental conditions. Some reached for the sky, others swept the ground, and still others targeted everything in between. This level of specialization allowed multiple species of giant herbivores to coexist in the same ecosystems without directly competing with each other. Late Jurassic formations like the Morrison Formation in North America have yielded fossils of dozens of different sauropod species, all living side by side and each filling a slightly different ecological role. But the story of sauropod diversification doesn't end with the Jurassic period. As we move into the Cretaceous, we see even more remarkable innovations and adaptations. The world was changing rapidly during this time, with flowering plants beginning to dominate terrestrial ecosystems and new types of predators evolving to challenge the dominance of giant herbivores. Sauropods responded to these challenges with even more spectacular adaptations. Some lineages developed armor plating, turning themselves into walking fortresses. Others evolved new feeding strategies to take advantage of the nutritious flowers and fruits that were becoming increasingly common. Still others pushed body size to even more extreme limits, becoming the largest land animals that have ever existed. The Cretaceous period saw the rise of the titanosaurs, and these animals represent the absolute peak of sauropod evolution in terms of both diversity and sheer impressiveness. Titanosaurs colonized every continent and adapted to an enormous range of different environments, from tropical forests to arid deserts to coastal plains. Some titanosaurs, like Allosaurus, developed extensive armor plating across their backs and sides, creating animals that looked like they were wearing medieval chain mail. These bony plates, called osteoderms, provided protection against the increasingly sophisticated predators of the Cretaceous period, including massive carcharodontosaurids and eventually tyrannosaurs. Other titanosaurs focused on pushing size to its absolute limits. Animals like Argentinosaurus and Patagodeton may have reached lengths of over 100 feet and weighed us approaching 100 tons. These creatures were so massive that they challenge our understanding of how large a land animal can possibly get, while still being able to move and function. The engineering challenges faced by these supergiants were absolutely staggering. How do you pump blood through a circulatory system that spans over 100 feet? How do you coordinate movement in a body with such massive inertia? How do you process enough food to fuel a metabolism that burns thousands of calories per hour? Titanosaurs solved these problems through a combination of anatomical innovations that were nothing short of miraculous. They had hearts that were probably the size of small cars, with blood pressure systems that could generate enough force to push blood all the way up their enormous necks. They had respiratory systems filled with air sacs that not only reduced their overall weight, but also created incredibly efficient oxygen exchange mechanisms. Their nervous systems were equipped with enlarged spinal cords, and possibly even auxiliary brain centers that helped coordinate movement in their massive bodies. Some researchers have suggested that the largest titanosaurs might have had something approaching distributed intelligence, with different parts of their bodies operating semi-independently under the coordination of the main brain. But perhaps most impressively, these animals managed to maintain all of these complex systems while still being able to reproduce successfully. The logistics of titanosaur reproduction boggle the mind. How does a 100-ton animal mate without crushing its partner? How do you incubate eggs that need to develop into creatures that will eventually weigh as much as a building? The answers to these questions are still being worked out by paleontologists, but what we do know suggests that titanosaurs had solved problems that no other land animals have ever had to face. They represent the absolute pinnacle of what's possible for terrestrial life, the ultimate expression of evolutionary engineering applied to the challenge of being a giant herbivore. Yet, despite their incredible success and diversity, all sauropod lineages faced the same ultimate challenge, the end Cretaceous extinction event that wiped out all non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The last titanosaurs, animals like Allosaurus, were still thriving right up until the very end, sharing their final world with Tyrannosaurus rex and other iconic late Cretaceous fauna. The extinction of the sauropods marked the end of an era that had lasted for over 150 million years. Never again would the earth see land animals of such incredible size and majesty. No mammal has ever come close to matching their proportions, and it's unlikely that any ever will. The unique combination of environmental conditions, evolutionary pressures, and physiological innovations that made sauropods possible was a one-time event in the history of life on Earth. But the legacy of these incredible animals lives on in more ways than just fossils and museum displays. Sauropods fundamentally changed our understanding of what's possible in animal evolution. They showed us that life can find solutions to seemingly impossible challenges, that evolution can create forms of almost unimaginable beauty and complexity. They also changed the ecosystems they lived in, acting as massive ecosystem engineers that shaped the very landscapes around them. Their feeding habits influenced plant evolution. Their movements created pathways through forests, and their waste products fertilized vast areas of ancient terrain. In many ways, the Mesozoic world was built around these giants. Understanding sauropod evolution also gives us crucial insights into some of the most fundamental questions in biology. How do organisms respond to environmental change? What are the limits of body size in terrestrial animals? How do complex physiological systems evolve to meet new challenges? The answers that sauropods provide to these questions are still being discovered by researchers around the world. New fossil discoveries continue to reveal previously unknown species and adaptations, while advanced imaging techniques and computer modeling are helping us understand how these animals actually lived and functioned. What's becoming clear is that sauropods were far more sophisticated and diverse than we ever imagined. They weren't just big, dumb herbivores plodding through ancient landscapes. They were highly specialized, incredibly successful animals that dominated their ecosystems for longer than any other group of large land vertebrates in Earth's history. Their story is one of innovation, adaptation, and evolutionary success on an almost unimaginable scale. From tiny bipedal ancestors to walking skyscrapers, sauropods represent one of evolution's greatest success stories and one of the most spectacular chapters in the history of life on our planet. And we're still just scratching the surface of understanding these remarkable creatures. Every new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, revealing new aspects of their biology, behavior, and evolution. The golden age of sauropod paleontology is happening right now, and who knows what incredible revelations await us in the fossils that have yet to be discovered. But here's where this story gets even more incredible. And honestly, this is the part that absolutely blows my mind every single time I think about it. We've been talking about these massive creatures and their incredible diversity, but we haven't really dug into the question that started this whole journey. How did they actually get so impossibly big? I mean, seriously, think about this for a second. We're talking about animals that weighed more than a dozen elephants put together, that had necks longer than telephone poles, that could look down at 3-story buildings. The physics alone should have made this impossible. So how did evolution manage to break every rule we thought we knew about animal size? The answer involves some of the most brilliant biological engineering solutions that nature has ever come up with. These weren't just scaled-up versions of smaller animals. No, sauropods had to completely reinvent how large land animals could work. And the innovations they developed are absolutely mind-blowing. Let's start with the most obvious challenge. How do you support that much weight? I mentioned earlier that sauropods evolved those column-like limbs, but the engineering behind those limbs is way more sophisticated than you might think. These weren't just thick bones holding up a heavy body. They were precision-engineered support structures that distributed weight with incredible efficiency. The bones themselves were hollow, filled with air sacs that reduced weight without sacrificing strength. Think about that for a moment. These animals figured out how to make their skeletons lighter while still being strong enough to support bodies that weighed as much as modern fighter jets. It's like building a skyscraper out of materials that are somehow both incredibly strong and surprisingly lightweight. But the limb bones were just the beginning. The entire skeleton was redesigned from the ground up to handle massive loads. The vertebrae in their spines weren't just bigger versions of normal vertebrae. They were architectural marvels with complex internal structures that created maximum strength with minimum weight. Some of these vertebrae had internal frameworks that look almost identical to the steel framework inside modern buildings. And here's something that really gets me excited about these animals. They didn't just solve the weight problem once and call it good. Different lineages came up with different solutions, each one perfectly adapted for their specific lifestyle and environment. The Titanosaurs developed one approach, the Diplodocids another, and the brachiosaurids yet another. It's like having three different teams of engineers all working on the same problem and coming up with completely different but equally brilliant solutions. Now, supporting all that weight was just the first challenge. The second problem was even more mind-boggling. How do you get enough food into a body that massive? Think about it. These animals needed to consume thousands of pounds of plant material every single day just to keep their metabolisms running. That's like eating an entire forest on a weekly basis. Remember that bulk feeding strategy we talked about earlier? This wasn't just a convenient feeding method. It was an absolute necessity for survival at these sizes. There simply weren't enough hours in the day to carefully chew all the food they needed. So sauropods evolved to become living food processing machines, capable of stripping vegetation and swallowing it at incredible rates. But here's where it gets really clever. Different sauropod lineages specialized in processing different types of vegetation, which allowed multiple giant species to coexist without competing directly for the same food sources. The high browsers went after treetops and tall vegetation. The ground-level specialists focused on ferns and low-growing plants. The mid-level feeders targeted everything in between. This kind of resource partitioning is incredibly sophisticated. It's like having a perfectly organized restaurant kitchen where different chefs specialize in different types of cuisine, all working in the same space but never getting in each other's way. The level of ecological coordination required for this to work is absolutely staggering. Then there's the circulation problem, and honestly, this might be the most impressive solution of all. How do you pump blood through a body that's over 100 feet long? How do you get oxygen to a brain that's sitting at the top of a 40-foot neck? Sauropods solved this with cardiovascular systems that make modern medical technology look primitive. Their hearts were probably the size of small cars, generating blood pressures that would be lethal to any other type of animal. They had specialized blood vessels and possibly even auxiliary pumping mechanisms that helped move blood through their enormous circulatory systems. Some researchers think the largest sauropods might have had multiple hearts, or at least heart-like structures distributed throughout their bodies to help maintain circulation. It's like having a network of pumping stations throughout a massive pipeline system, each one helping to keep the flow moving efficiently. The respiratory challenges were equally impressive. How do you get enough oxygen into a body that size? Sauropods solved this with the most sophisticated respiratory system that has ever evolved in a land animal. Those air sacs I mentioned weren't just for reducing weight. They were part of an incredibly efficient breathing apparatus that could extract maximum oxygen from every breath. The air sac system worked like a biological supercharger, allowing sauropods to process oxygen much more efficiently than mammals of equivalent size could manage. Some scientists think this respiratory system was so advanced that it might have allowed sauropods to remain active even in low oxygen environments that would have been lethal to other large animals. But perhaps the most mind-blowing aspect of sauropod biology was their growth rate. These animals didn't just slowly plod their way to giant size over centuries. No, they grew incredibly fast, reaching adult size in just a few decades. We're talking about growth rates that would make a bamboo plant jealous. Recent studies of sauropod bone tissue have revealed growth rings that show these animals could gain several tons of body weight per year during their peak growing periods. That's like adding the weight of a small car to your body mass every 12 months. The metabolic machinery required to sustain that kind of growth is absolutely staggering. This rapid growth was crucial for sauropod survival. In a world full of massive predators, being small was basically a death sentence. The young sauropods had to reach a safe size as quickly as possible, and the faster they could grow, the better their chances of survival. It was an evolutionary arms race between predator and prey, with body size as the ultimate weapon. Different sauropod lineages approached this growth challenge in different ways. Some focused on reaching maximum length as quickly as possible, prioritizing reach over bulk. Others concentrated on building up body mass first, then adding length later. Each strategy had its advantages and disadvantages, and the diversity of approaches shows just how flexible sauropod development could be. The neurological challenges of being a sauropod were equally fascinating. How do you coordinate movement in a body that spans over 100 feet? How do you process sensory information from extremities that are dozens of feet away from your brain? How do you react quickly enough to threats when nerve signals take significant time to travel from your tail to your head? Sauropods appears to have solved these problems through a combination of approaches. They had enlarged spinal cords that could process information locally without always having to send signals all the way back to the brain. They developed predictive movement patterns that allowed them to coordinate their massive bodies efficiently. And they may have had distributed processing centers that helped manage different aspects of their physiology. Some researchers have even suggested that the largest sauropods might have had something approaching distributed intelligence, with different parts of their bodies operating semi-independently while still coordinating with the main brain. It's like having a computer network where different processors handle different tasks, but all work together toward common goals. The sensory challenges were equally impressive. How do you navigate the world when your head is 40 feet off the ground, but your body extends for another 60 feet behind you? How do you keep track of your environment when your field of view is constantly changing as you move your neck around? Sauropods developed some fascinating solutions to these problems. Their eyes were positioned to give them excellent all-around vision, allowing them to monitor their environment even while feeding. Their enlarged nasal regions suggest they had incredibly sophisticated senses of smell, possibly allowing them to detect food sources, predators, or other sauropods from great distances. Some species developed specialized sensory structures that we're still trying to understand. Those distinctive crests on macronarian skulls might have been acoustic resonators, allowing these animals to communicate over long distances using low-frequency calls. Imagine the sound of a 100-foot-long animal calling to its herd mates. It would have been like biological thunder rolling across ancient landscapes. The social aspects of sauropod life add another layer of complexity to their story. Recent fossil discoveries have revealed evidence of herding behavior, with groups of sauropods traveling together and possibly coordinating their feeding activities. Managing social interactions when you're the size of a building creates challenges that no other animals have ever had to face. How do you communicate with other members of your species when you're spread out over hundreds of yards? How do you coordinate group movements when each individual takes up the space of a small building? How do you resolve conflicts without accidentally crushing your neighbors? These are the kinds of problems that sauropods had to solve on a daily basis, and the solutions they developed were nothing short of brilliant. They created social systems that allowed dozens of giant individuals to coexist peacefully, feeding strategies that minimized competition within herds, and communication methods that worked across the vast distances their size created. The reproductive challenges faced by sauropods were equally mind-boggling. How does a 100-ton animal mate without crushing its partner? How do you incubate eggs that need to develop into creatures that will eventually weigh as much as a fighter jet? How do you care for young when you're so massive that you could accidentally step on them? Recent fossil discoveries have started to give us clues about how sauropods handled reproduction, and the answers are absolutely fascinating. Some species appear to have built massive communal nesting sites where multiple females would lay their eggs together. These nesting grounds were probably some of the most impressive sights in the ancient world, with dozens of giant females carefully tending to thousands of eggs. The eggs themselves were surprisingly small relative to adult body size, which makes sense when you think about it. A sauropod egg that was proportional to adult size would have been impossible for the baby to break out of. Instead, sauropods hatched at relatively small sizes and then underwent the most spectacular growth spurts in the history of animal development. Baby sauropods faced incredible challenges. They had to grow from house cat-sized hatchlings to building-sized adults while avoiding predators, finding enough food, and somehow not getting accidentally trampled by their own parents. The survival strategies developed by young sauropods were probably just as sophisticated as those of the adults. Some evidence suggests that young sauropods may have had completely different lifestyles from adults, living in different habitats and eating different foods until they reached a safe size. This kind of ontogenetic niche shifting is incredibly sophisticated and shows just how flexible sauropod development could be. The environmental impact of sauropods was absolutely staggering. These animals were living ecosystem engineers, reshaping entire landscapes through their feeding and movement patterns. A herd of large sauropods could strip all the vegetation from an area in a matter of days, creating clearings that would persist for years. Their waste products alone could fertilize enormous areas, creating rich soil conditions that supported diverse plant communities. Some researchers estimate that a large sauropod could produce several tons of fertilizer per day, essentially acting as a walking nutrient distribution system. The pathways created by migrating sauropod herds probably persisted for decades or even centuries, creating corridors through forests that other animals could use. These giants were literally reshaping the geography of their world through their daily activities. But perhaps most impressively, sauropods managed to maintain this incredible lifestyle for over 150 million years. That's longer than any other group of large land animals has ever dominated terrestrial ecosystems. During that time, they survived mass extinctions, climate changes, continental drift, and the evolution of increasingly sophisticated predators. Their success wasn't just about being big, it was about being incredibly well adapted to their chosen lifestyle and incredibly flexible in the face of changing conditions. Different lineages evolved different solutions to the same basic challenges, creating a diversity of approaches that made the group incredibly resilient. The technological implications of sauropod biology are still being explored by modern researchers. Engineers are studying sauropod bone structure to develop new lightweight building materials. Computer scientists are examining their distributed nervous systems for insights into managing complex networks. Even roboticists are looking at sauropod locomotion for ideas about controlling very large mechanical systems. In many ways, sauropods solved engineering problems that we're still struggling with today. They created biological systems that were simultaneously massive and efficient, complex and reliable, powerful and precise. The solutions they evolved through millions of years of natural selection are inspiring new approaches to some of our most challenging technological problems. But beyond their practical applications, sauropods represent something even more important. They show us what's possible when evolution has enough time and the right conditions to work with. They demonstrate that life can find solutions to seemingly impossible challenges and create forms of almost unimaginable beauty and complexity. The story of sauropod evolution is really the story of life itself, creative, resilient, and constantly pushing the boundaries of what seems possible. These animals didn't just get big by accident. They evolved sophisticated solutions to fundamental biological challenges, creating innovations that allowed them to thrive in a dangerous world for longer than any other group of large land animals. And here's the really amazing part. We're still discovering new things about these incredible creatures. Every new fossil find reveals previously unknown adaptations and behaviors. Advanced imaging techniques are allowing us to peer inside fossilized bones and understand how these animals actually functioned. Computer modeling is helping us reconstruct their movements, their feeding strategies, and their social behaviors. The golden age of sauropod research is happening right now, and the discoveries being made are more spectacular than anything we could have imagined just a few decades ago. We're learning that these animals were far more sophisticated, diverse, and successful than we ever dreamed possible. But there's still so much more to discover. Vast areas of the world remain unexplored for sauropod fossils. New analytical techniques are being developed that will reveal even more details about their biology and behavior. And computer simulations are getting sophisticated enough to model these animals as complete, functioning ecosystems. The future of sauropod research promises to be just as exciting as its past. Who knows what incredible revelations await us in the rocks that have yet to be explored? What new species will be discovered? What new adaptations will be revealed? What new insights into the fundamental nature of life itself will these ancient giants provide? One thing is certain. The story of sauropod evolution will continue to inspire and amaze us for generations to come. These animals represent one of evolution's greatest achievements, and understanding how they lived and thrived gives us crucial insights into the nature of life itself. From tiny bipedal ancestors to walking skyscrapers, from simple plant eaters to sophisticated ecosystem engineers, sauropods transform themselves and their world in ways that continue to challenge our understanding of what's possible in biology. They were true giants in every sense of the word, and their legacy will continue to shape our understanding of life on Earth for centuries to come. The next time you see a giraffe and feel small, remember that once upon a time, our planet was home to creatures that would have made that giraffe look like a house pet. Remember that evolution can create wonders beyond our wildest imagination, and that the history of life on Earth is filled with stories more incredible than any fiction. Sauropods weren't just big dinosaurs. They were living proof that life finds a way, no matter how impossible the challenges might seem. They were evolution's masterpiece, and their story continues to unfold with every new discovery we make about these magnificent ancient giants. But understanding how sauropods achieved their incredible size is only part of the story. What really gets me fired up about these animals is how they managed to diversify into so many different forms while maintaining their gigantic proportions. We're talking about an evolutionary explosion that produced some of the most bizarre and spectacular creatures that have ever walked the earth. So let's dive into the real meat of sauropod evolution, the incredible radiation that happened during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. This is where things get absolutely wild, because we're not just talking about one type of giant herbivore anymore. We're talking about dozens of different species, each one perfectly adapted for different lifestyles, different environments, and different feeding strategies. The diversification started with a group called Neosauropoda, which literally means new sauropods. And these animals brought some game-changing innovations to the table. They completely redesigned their feeding apparatus, concentrating their teeth at the front of their mouths to create what were essentially biological crop shears. This allowed them to be incredibly selective about what they ate, targeting the most nutritious parts of plants while leaving behind the tough, indigestible material. But here's where it gets really interesting. Neosauropoda split into two major evolutionary branches, and each one took a completely different approach to being a successful giant herbivore. It's like having two different teams of engineers working on the same problem and coming up with radically different but equally brilliant solutions. The first branch was called Macronaria, and these guys lived up to their name, which means big noses. We're talking about animals with massively enlarged nasal regions and distinctive crests on top of their skulls. Some scientists think these enlarged nasal structures might have been used for temperature regulation, helping these massive animals manage their body heat in various climates. The most famous early macronarian is probably Camarasaurus, and this animal gives us a perfect example of how sophisticated these creatures had become. Camarasaurus had a skull that looked almost alien compared to earlier sauropods, with huge nasal openings and teeth that were perfectly designed for processing specific types of vegetation. These weren't just bigger versions of primitive sauropods. They were highly specialized feeding machines. But Camarasaurus was just the beginning of the macronarian story. This lineage eventually produced the Titanosauriforms, and these animals represent some of the most spectacular adaptations in all of dinosaur evolution. Titanosauriforms took the big nose concept and ran with it, developing massive snouts with prominent ridges and crests that made them look like they belonged in a fantasy novel. More importantly, Titanosauriforms perfected the art of extreme neck elongation. We're talking about animals whose necks made up more than half their total body length, allowing them to browse vegetation at heights that no other land animal could possibly reach. The engineering behind these necks is absolutely mind-blowing. They weren't just stretched-out versions of normal necks. They were precision instruments, filled with air sacs for weight reduction and supported by incredibly complex muscle systems. Within the Titanosauriforms, we find one of the most iconic groups of sauropods, the Brachiosauridae. These animals represent perhaps the most recognizable image most people have of long-necked dinosaurs. Brachiosaurus, with its incredibly long front legs and towering posture, stood as tall as a 4-story building and could reach vegetation nearly 60 feet off the ground. But what really blows my mind about brachiosaurids is how they managed to make such an extreme body plan actually work. Having front legs that are longer than your back legs creates all sorts of engineering challenges. How do you maintain balance? How do you coordinate movement? How do you generate enough power to move such a massive body around? Brachiosaurids solved these problems through a combination of anatomical innovations that were nothing short of brilliant. Their spines were reinforced with incredibly strong ligaments that acted like biological suspension cables. Their shoulder girdles were massively enlarged to support the weight of their enormous necks. Their hip joints were redesigned to handle the unusual weight distribution created by their front-heavy build. The result was an animal that could function as a living skyscraper, reaching vegetation that no other herbivore could access. But brachiosaurids weren't alone in their high-rise lifestyle. The Titanosauriforms also produced other long-neck specialists, including some forms that pushed neck length to even more extreme limits. Some members of this group had necks that were so long they challenge our understanding of what should be physically possible. We're talking about animals whose heads were literally 50 feet off the ground, supported by necks that contained more vertebrae than any other land animal has ever possessed. The logistics of pumping blood up a 50-foot neck, of coordinating movement across such distances, of maintaining sensory awareness when your head is that far from your body, these are problems that no other animals have ever had to solve. But the macronarians weren't the only success story in Neosauropoda. The second major branch took a completely different approach to being a giant herbivore, and their innovations were just as remarkable in their own way. This group was called Diplodocus, and they decided to focus on ground-level and low-level browsing instead of reaching for the sky. Diplodocoids were absolutely revolutionary in their feeding strategies. While their macronarian cousins were locked in an arms race to reach higher and higher vegetation, Diplodocoids perfected the art of efficient low-level browsing. They developed some of the most sophisticated feeding apparatus we've ever seen in herbivorous dinosaurs. The key to Diplodocoid success was their body proportions. These animals had relatively shorter front limbs compared to their hind limbs, giving them a distinctive downward-sloping profile that was perfectly adapted for ground-level feeding. But they didn't just settle for being low browsers. They developed skull and dental adaptations that were incredibly sophisticated. Diplodocoid heads became elongated and narrow, almost horse-like in their proportions, but with dental arrangements that were far more advanced than anything we see in modern animals. They evolved what scientists call pencil-shaped teeth, positioned only at the very front of their jaws. This created what was essentially a biological hedge trimmer, perfectly designed for stripping leaves and soft vegetation with incredible precision. This dental arrangement allowed Diplodocoids to be incredibly selective feeders. They could carefully strip the most nutritious parts of plants while leaving behind the tough woody material that was harder to digest. It was like having a built-in quality control system that ensured they were getting maximum nutrition from every bite. The Diplodocoid group split into several different families, each one pushing these innovations in slightly different directions. The Dicraeosauridae were the more conservative branch, with relatively shorter necks that allowed them to specialize in mid-level browsing. These animals filled the perfect ecological niche between ground-dwelling herbivores and the super long-necked giants. Some Dicraeosaurids developed absolutely spectacular display features. A Margosaurus, for example, had a row of tall parallel spines running along its neck and back, possibly supporting skin membranes that could be used for communication or temperature regulation. These animals looked like living sailboats with decorative features that would have made them unmistakable in their ancient environments. But the real stars of the Diplodocoid show were the Diplodocidae, and these animals pushed neck elongation and feeding efficiency to absolutely ridiculous extremes. When most people picture a long-necked dinosaur, they're probably thinking of a diplodocid, even if they don't realize it. Diplodocids had necks that stretched over 25 feet, but unlike the macronarians, who used their long necks primarily for reaching high vegetation, diplodocids had a completely different strategy. These animals could use their incredibly flexible necks like massive vacuum cleaners, sweeping them back and forth across the ground to strip vegetation over enormous areas without having to move their massive bodies. The feeding efficiency this created was absolutely staggering. A diplodocid could stand in one spot and clear every edible plant within a 50-foot radius just by moving its head around. That's the kind of feeding strategy that could support a multi-ton body without requiring constant movement to new feeding areas. The most famous diplodocid is Diplodocus itself, an animal that stretched over 80 feet from nose to tail, but was actually relatively lightweight for a sauropod. The secret was in its construction. Hollow bones filled with air sacs, elongated proportions that distributed weight efficiently, and a body plan that prioritized reach and flexibility over raw bulk. But even Diplodocus wasn't the most famous member of its family. That honor goes to Brontosaurus, an animal that's been at the center of one of paleontology's most entertaining controversies. For decades, scientists argued about whether Brontosaurus was actually a separate species or just another name for Apatosaurus. The debate got so heated that it involved everything from academic rivalry to outright fossil disputes. Recent research has confirmed that Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus are indeed separate animals, though they're very closely related. Both animals shared the same basic body plan and lifestyle, but Brontosaurus was slightly more robust with different skull proportions. And what a lifestyle these animals had. Diplodocids possessed some of the most remarkable tails in the entire animal kingdom. These tails were incredibly long and ended in thin, whip-like sections that could be moved at tremendous speeds. Some researchers have calculated that these tails could actually break the sound barrier when snapped, creating literal sonic booms. Just think about that for a moment. We're talking about animals that could weaponize sound itself, using their tails like biological whips to create thundercrack noises that could be heard for miles. Whether they used this ability for defense, communication, or dominance displays, the physics definitely work out. These animals had natural sound weapons that were more powerful than anything humans could create until the invention of explosives. The third major group of diplodocoids was even more specialized and frankly even stranger. The Rebicusauridae took selective feeding to its absolute extreme, developing some of the most unusual skull adaptations we've ever seen in any herbivore. Rebicusaurids had faces that pointed almost straight down, like they were perpetually looking at the ground. Their snouts were broad and flared out at the front, and their teeth were arranged in patterns that created what was essentially a biological lawnmower. These animals were perfectly adapted for processing ground cover, ferns, and low-growing vegetation. The most extreme example of this specialization was Nigersaurus, and this creature had one of the most bizarre skulls in the entire fossil record. Nigersaurus had over 500 tiny teeth arranged in multiple rows across its broad, flat snout. As teeth wore out from constant use, new ones would replace them from behind, creating a continuously self-sharpening feeding apparatus. This dental arrangement was so unusual that when paleontologists first discovered Nigersaurus fossils, they couldn't figure out how the skull was supposed to fit together. It looked like no other dinosaur skull they'd ever seen, with proportions that seemed almost impossible for a living animal. It wasn't until they found more complete specimens that they realized they were looking at perhaps the most specialized herbivore that ever lived. Nigersaurus could process ground-level vegetation with incredible efficiency, essentially mowing down entire patches of ferns and low-growing plants as it walked through Cretaceous forests. Its feeding strategy was so specialized that it probably couldn't lift its head more than a few feet off the ground, but within its chosen niche, it was absolutely dominant. The success of these different diplodocoid lineages shows us something really important about sauropod evolution. These animals didn't just compete with each other for the same resources. Instead, they divided up the available food sources with incredible precision, allowing multiple species of giant herbivores to coexist in the same ecosystems without directly competing. This level of resource partitioning allowed late Jurassic and Cretaceous ecosystems to support an incredible diversity of giant herbivores. Formations like the Morrison Formation in North America have yielded fossils of dozens of different sauropod species, all living side by side and each filling a slightly different ecological role. High browsers like Brontosaurus targeted tree canopies and tall vegetation. Ground-level specialists like Nigersaurus focused on ferns and ground cover. Mid-level feeders targeted everything in between. Some species specialized in tough, fibrous vegetation, while others focused on soft, nutritious plant parts. The level of ecological coordination this required is absolutely staggering. But the story of sauropod diversification doesn't end with the Jurassic period. As we move into the Cretaceous, we see even more remarkable innovations and adaptations. The world was changing rapidly during this time, with flowering plants beginning to revolutionize terrestrial ecosystems and new types of predators evolving to challenge the dominance of giant herbivores. Sauropods responded to these challenges with even more spectacular adaptations. The Cretaceous period saw the rise of the titanosaurs, and these animals represent the absolute peak of sauropod evolution in terms of both diversity and sheer impressiveness. Titanosaurs colonized every continent and adapted to an enormous range of different environments. Some titanosaurs developed extensive armor plating, turning themselves into walking fortresses. Saltosaurus had bony plates called osteoderms covering its back and sides, creating an animal that looked like it was wearing medieval chain mail. These armor plates provided protection against the increasingly sophisticated predators of the Cretaceous period. Other titanosaurs focused on pushing size to its absolute limits. Animals like Argentinosaurus and Apatosaurus may have reached lengths of over 100 feet and weights approaching 100 tons. These creatures were so massive that they challenge our understanding of how large a land animal can possibly get, while still being able to move and function. The engineering challenges faced by these supergiants were absolutely mind-boggling. Their hearts were probably the size of small cars, generating blood pressures that would be instantly fatal to any other type of animal. Their respiratory systems had to process enormous volumes of air to supply oxygen to their massive bodies. Their nervous systems had to coordinate movement across distances that would challenge modern communication systems. But perhaps most impressively, these animals managed to reproduce successfully despite their incredible size. The logistics of titanosaur reproduction boggle the mind, but somehow these giants figured out how to mate, lay eggs, and raise young while weighing as much as modern buildings. Recent fossil discoveries have revealed evidence of massive communal nesting sites where multiple female titanosaurs would lay their eggs together. These nesting grounds must have been some of the most impressive sights in the ancient world, with dozens of giant females carefully tending to thousands of eggs in coordinated breeding colonies. The babies that hatched from these eggs faced incredible challenges. They had to grow from relatively small hatchlings to building-sized adults while avoiding predators and somehow not getting accidentally trampled by their own parents. The survival strategies developed by young sauropods were probably just as sophisticated as those of the adults. The environmental impact of these massive herbivores was absolutely staggering. Titanosaur herds could strip all the vegetation from enormous areas in a matter of days, creating clearings that would persist for years. Their waste products alone could fertilize vast territories, creating rich soil conditions that supported diverse plant communities. A large titanosaur could produce several tons of fertilizer per day, essentially acting as a walking nutrient distribution system. The pathways created by migrating titanosaur herds probably persisted for decades or even centuries, creating corridors through forests that other animals could use. But what really impresses me about titanosaurs is their incredible diversity. These weren't just one type of supergiant repeated over and over. Different species evolved different solutions to the challenge of being a massive herbivore. Some had longer necks, others had more robust builds. Some developed armor, others focused on pure size. Some lived in forests, others in open plains or coastal environments. This diversity allowed titanosaurs to colonize virtually every type of terrestrial environment on Earth. They thrived in tropical forests, arid deserts, coastal plains, and highland regions. No other group of large land animals has ever achieved such widespread ecological success. The success of titanosaurs continued right up until the end of the Cretaceous period. The last members of this group, animals like Allosaurus, were still thriving right up until the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs. These final giants shared their world with Tyrannosaurus rex and other iconic late Cretaceous fauna, representing the culmination of over 150 million years of sauropod evolution. The extinction of the sauropods marked the end of an era that had lasted longer than any other period of large terrestrial animal dominance in Earth's history. Never again would the planet see land animals of such incredible size and diversity. The unique combination of environmental conditions, evolutionary pressures, and biological innovations that made sauropods possible was truly a one-time event. But the legacy of these incredible animals extends far beyond just their fossils. Sauropods fundamentally changed our understanding of what's possible in animal evolution. They showed us that life can find solutions to seemingly impossible challenges and create forms of almost unimaginable complexity and beauty. They also serve as incredible examples of evolutionary innovation and adaptation. The solutions they developed to the challenges of being giant herbivores, from their specialized feeding strategies to their sophisticated cardiovascular systems to their complex social behaviors, continue to inspire researchers in fields ranging from engineering to computer science to medicine. Understanding sauropod evolution gives us crucial insights into some of the most fundamental questions in biology. How do organisms respond to environmental change? What are the limits of body size in terrestrial animals? How do complex physiological systems evolve to meet new challenges? How do ecosystems organize themselves to support such incredible diversity? The answers that sauropods provide to these questions are still being discovered by researchers around the world. New fossil discoveries continue to reveal previously unknown species and adaptations. Advanced imaging techniques are allowing us to peer inside fossilized bones and understand how these animals actually functioned. Computer modeling is helping us reconstruct their movements, their feeding strategies, and their social behaviors with unprecedented accuracy. What's becoming clear is that sauropods were far more sophisticated and successful than we ever imagined. They weren't just big, slow herbivores plodding through ancient landscapes. They were highly specialized, incredibly successful animals that dominated their ecosystems through a combination of size, efficiency, and behavioral sophistication that no other land animals have ever matched. Their story is one of innovation, adaptation, and evolutionary success on an almost unimaginable scale, from tiny bipedal ancestors to walking skyscrapers, from simple plant eaters to sophisticated ecosystem engineers. Sauropods transform themselves and their world in ways that continue to challenge our understanding of what's possible in biology. And we're still just beginning to understand these remarkable creatures. The golden age of sauropod research is happening right now, with new discoveries being made every year that add new chapters to their incredible story. Advanced analytical techniques are revealing details about their biology and behavior that would have been impossible to discover just a few decades ago. The future promises even more exciting revelations. Vast areas of the world remain unexplored for sauropod fossils. New technologies are being developed that will allow us to extract even more information from the specimens we already have. Computer simulations are getting sophisticated enough to model these animals as complete, functioning biological systems. Who knows what incredible discoveries await us in the rocks that have yet to be explored? What new species will be found? What new adaptations will be revealed? What new insights into the fundamental nature of life itself will these ancient giants provide? One thing is certain: the story of sauropod evolution will continue to inspire and amaze us for generations to come. These animals represent one of evolution's greatest success stories, a testament to the incredible creativity and adaptability of life on Earth. From their humble beginnings as small bipedal dinosaurs to their transformation into the largest land animals that have ever existed, sauropods show us what's possible when evolution has enough time and the right conditions to work with. They demonstrate that life can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and create wonders that surpass our wildest imagination. The next time you look up at a tall building or a towering tree, remember that once upon a time, our planet was home to living creatures that were just as impressive. Remember that the history of life on Earth is filled with stories more incredible than any fiction, and that understanding these stories helps us appreciate the remarkable world we live in today. Sauropods weren't just dinosaurs. They were proof that evolution can create miracles, that life finds a way no matter how impossible the odds might seem. They were living examples of what happens when natural selection has millions of years to perfect its craft, and their legacy continues to shape our understanding of life, evolution, and the incredible potential that exists within the natural world. But here's what really gets me pumped about this whole sauropod story. And trust me, this is where things get absolutely insane. We haven't even talked about the most mind-blowing part yet. All of these incredible adaptations, all of this spectacular diversity, all of these engineering marvels that we've been discussing, they were happening in ecosystems that were more complex and more competitive than anything we see on Earth today. Picture this for a second. You're standing in the late Jurassic forest, and it's not just one or two species of giant herbivores wandering around. No, we're talking about entire communities of these massive creatures, each one perfectly adapted for a different lifestyle, all coexisting in the same environment. It's like someone took every type of large mammal we see in modern Africa and scaled them up by a factor of 10, then added a bunch of completely alien forms that have no modern equivalent. The level of ecological organization required for this to work is absolutely staggering. These weren't just random giant animals bumbling around and hoping not to bump into each other. This was a sophisticated, highly organized biological community where every species had its own specific role in feeding strategy. High up in the canopy, you've got your brachiosaurids using their incredibly long front legs and towering necks to browse vegetation that no other animal could possibly reach. These were like living biological cranes, able to access food sources that were completely unavailable to everything else in their environment. Down at ground level, you've got your specialized low browsers like the rhybacosaurids, essentially acting as biological lawnmowers, keeping the understory vegetation trimmed and maintained. These animals were so specialized for ground-level feeding that they couldn't even lift their heads more than a few feet off the ground. In between, you've got your mid-level specialists, targeting all the vegetation in that middle zone that the high browsers couldn't be bothered with, and the ground specialist couldn't reach. And then you've got your generalists, the animals that could feed at multiple levels depending on what was available. But here's where it gets really crazy. This wasn't just about feeding height. Different species were also specializing in different types of vegetation. Some had teeth perfectly designed for processing tough, fibrous plant material. Others focused on soft, nutritious leaves and shoots. Some could handle the massive, woody stems of primitive conifers, while others specialized in delicate ferns and early flowering plants. The result was an ecosystem that could support an absolutely incredible biomass of giant herbivores without any of them directly competing for the same resources. We're talking about biological communities where the total weight of herbivorous dinosaurs per square mile was probably higher than anything we see in modern ecosystem. And this wasn't just happening in one location. These diverse sauropod communities were thriving all over the world, from North America to Europe to Africa to Asia. Everywhere paleontologists look for late Jurassic and Cretaceous fossils, they find evidence of these incredibly complex sauropod ecosystems. But supporting all of these giant herbivores created its own set of challenges. How do you maintain plant communities when you've got herds of multi-ton animals constantly browsing through them? How do ecosystems recover from the massive disturbances created by migrating sauropod herds? The answer is that these ancient ecosystems had evolved sophisticated recovery mechanisms that we're only just beginning to understand. Plant communities developed rapid regrowth strategies that allowed them to bounce back quickly after being browsed. Some species probably evolved specifically to take advantage of the nutrient-rich conditions created by sauropod waste products. The sauropods themselves became crucial ecosystem engineers, creating and maintaining the very environments they depended on. Their feeding activities created clearings that allowed new types of plants to establish themselves. Their movement patterns created pathways that other animals could use. Their waste products fertilized enormous areas, supporting rich plant communities that could sustain entire food webs. Recent research has even suggested that some plant species may have evolved specifically to be eaten by sauropods. These plants developed nutritious fruits or leaves positioned at exactly the right height for sauropod feeding, essentially entering into mutually beneficial relationships with their giant herbivore partners. The complexity of these ecological relationships is absolutely mind-blowing. We're talking about ecosystems where plants and animals had co-evolved for millions of years to create incredibly sophisticated biological communities. The level of interdependence between different species was probably far more complex than anything we see in modern ecosystems, but all of this ecological complexity also created incredible opportunities for predators, where you have enormous concentrations of giant herbivores. You're going to attract some seriously impressive carnivores. And the predators that evolved to hunt sauropods were absolutely spectacular. We're talking about animals like Allosaurus with its massive skull and bone-crushing jaws perfectly designed for taking down multi-ton prey, or Giganotosaurus, one of the largest land predators that ever lived, with teeth like railroad spikes and a bite force that could crush car engines. But here's what's really fascinating about sauropod-predator interactions. These weren't just simple predator-prey relationships. The evolution of giant herbivores drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies and predator adaptations. Some carnivores evolved to hunt in packs, coordinating their attacks to bring down prey that was far too large for any individual predator to handle. Others developed specialized hunting techniques, targeting specific vulnerable points on sauropod anatomy. Some may have been ambush predators, using surprise and overwhelming force to bring down their massive prey. Others might have been persistence hunters, wearing down their victims through prolonged chases. The arms race between sauropod defenses and predator adaptations created some of the most spectacular evolutionary innovations we've ever seen. Sauropods developed everything from weaponized tails that could break the sound barrier to armor plating that could deflect massive predator attacks. Some species evolved to live in herds where adults could protect juveniles from predator attacks. The social behaviors that emerged from these predator-prey interactions were probably incredibly sophisticated. Recent fossil evidence suggests that some sauropods lived in complex social groups with established hierarchies, communication systems, and cooperative defense strategies. Imagine witnessing a sauropod herd under attack from a pack of giant predators. The coordination required for dozens of multi-ton animals to organize an effective defense would have been absolutely spectacular. Adult sauropods forming protective circles around juveniles, using their massive size and weaponized tails to fend off attackers while coordinating their movements to avoid accidentally trampling their own young. These kinds of complex social behaviors require sophisticated communication systems, and there's growing evidence that sauropods had developed some of the most advanced animal communication methods that have ever existed. Those enlarged nasal regions weren't just for breathing. They were probably acoustic resonators that allowed these animals to produce low-frequency calls that could travel for miles. Picture the soundscape of a late Jurassic ecosystem. The deep, resonant calls of sauropod herds communicating across vast distances, the thunderous footsteps of migrating giants, the crack of weaponized tails breaking the sound barrier, the roar of massive predators coordinating their hunting strategies. It would have been like nothing we can experience in the modern world. But the most impressive aspect of sauropod social behavior was probably their reproductive strategies. Managing reproduction when you weigh as much as a building creates challenges that no other animals have ever had to face. Recent fossil discoveries have revealed evidence of massive communal nesting sites where dozens of female sauropods would coordinate their breeding activities. These nesting colonies were probably some of the most impressive biological spectacles that have ever existed on Earth. Imagine hundreds of giant females, each weighing dozens of tons, carefully coordinating their egg-laying activities across enormous areas. The level of social organization required for this to work successfully is absolutely staggering. The eggs themselves were engineering marvels. They had to be strong enough to support the weight of incubating adults, but thin enough for hatchlings to break out of. They had to maintain proper temperature and humidity levels despite being buried in massive communal nests. They had to develop quickly enough to minimize the vulnerable incubation period. Baby sauropods faced incredible survival challenges from the moment they hatched. They were born into a world of giants where they could easily be accidentally trampled by their own parents. They had to grow incredibly quickly to reach a safe size while finding enough food to fuel their explosive growth rates. Some evidence suggests that young sauropods may have had completely different lifestyles from adults, living in different habitats and forming their own age-specific social groups until they reached maturity. This kind of ontogenetic niche shifting shows just how flexible and sophisticated sauropod development could be. The parental care strategies developed by sauropods were probably just as advanced as their feeding and defensive adaptations. Some species may have provided extended care for their young, protecting them during their vulnerable growth phases and teaching them essential survival skills. Recent research has even suggested that some sauropod species may have had extended family structures, with multiple generations living together in complex social groups. Grandparent sauropods helping to protect and educate their grandchildren. Experienced adults sharing knowledge about feeding locations, migration routes, and predator avoidance strategies. The cultural transmission that this kind of social structure would allow is absolutely fascinating. Knowledge about optimal feeding strategies, seasonal migration patterns, and predator defense techniques could be passed down through generations, creating sauropod cultures that became increasingly sophisticated over time. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of sauropod evolution was their incredible resilience in the face of changing environmental conditions. These animals thrived for over 150 million years, surviving multiple mass extinction events, dramatic climate changes, and major shifts in plant and predator communities. During the late Triassic extinction event, early sauropodomorphs not only survived, but actually expanded their ecological range, taking advantage of the ecological disruption to colonize new environments. During the early Jurassic warming period, they diversified into an incredible array of different forms, each adapted for different climate conditions. When flowering plants began to revolutionize terrestrial ecosystems during the Cretaceous period, sauropods didn't just adapt. They thrived, developing new feeding strategies to take advantage of the nutritious flowers and fruits that were becoming increasingly common. Even when faced with increasingly sophisticated predators, sauropods continued to innovate and adapt. They developed new defensive strategies, more complex social behaviors, and increasingly impressive body sizes that helped them maintain their dominance of terrestrial ecosystems. This incredible adaptability was probably the key to their long-term success. Unlike many other dinosaur groups that became highly specialized for specific environmental conditions, sauropods maintained enough flexibility to respond to changing circumstances while still excelling at their chosen lifestyle of giant herbivory. Different lineages evolved different solutions to the same basic challenges, creating a diversity of approaches that made the group incredibly resilient to environmental changes. When one type of feeding strategy became less effective, other lineages were ready to take advantage of new opportunities. The geographic distribution of sauropods also contributed to their success. By the Cretaceous period, different continents had developed their own distinct sauropod faunas, each adapted for local environmental conditions. This geographic diversity meant that global environmental changes were unlikely to affect all sauropod populations simultaneously. The Titanosaurs of South America developed different adaptations from the Titanosaurs of Africa or Asia. European sauropods faced different challenges from their North American relatives. This geographic specialization created a global network of sauropod populations that could survive regional extinctions and recolonize areas that had been temporarily disrupted. But all of this incredible success, all of this evolutionary innovation, all of this ecological dominance came to an abrupt end 66 million years ago with the asteroid impact that marked the end of the Cretaceous period. The extinction of the sauropods was part of the larger mass extinction event that eliminated all non-avian dinosaurs, but it marked the end of one of the most successful evolutionary experiments in the history of life on Earth. The last sauropods, animals like Allosaurus, were still innovating and adapting right up until the very end. These final giants had developed new defensive strategies, new feeding techniques, and new social behaviors that might have allowed them to continue thriving for millions more years if the asteroid hadn't intervened. The suddenness of their extinction makes their loss even more tragic. These weren't animals that were slowly declining due to gradual environmental changes. They were at the peak of their evolutionary success when the asteroid impact changed everything in a matter of hours. The environmental devastation that followed the impact was simply too severe and too rapid for even the most adaptable sauropods to survive. The collapse of plant communities eliminated their food sources. The dramatic climate changes exceeded their physiological tolerances. The breakdown of ecological relationships destroyed the complex ecosystems they depended on. Within a few thousand years, creatures that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 150 million years were gone forever. The age of giants had ended, and the Earth would never again see land animals of such incredible size and majesty. The ecological void left by the extinction of sauropods was enormous. No other group of herbivores has ever managed to fill the niche they occupied. Modern elephants, the largest surviving land herbivores, are tiny compared to even the smallest sauropods. The complex ecological relationships they had created took millions of years to be replaced by entirely different types of biological communities. But the legacy of sauropods extends far beyond their ecological role. These animals represent one of evolution's greatest achievements, a demonstration of what's possible when natural selection has enough time and the right conditions to work with. They show us that life can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and create forms of almost unimaginable complexity and beauty. The technological implications of sauropod biology continue to inspire modern research and innovation. Engineers study their bone structure to develop new lightweight building materials. Computer scientists examine their distributed nervous systems for insights into managing complex networks. Roboticists analyze their locomotion patterns for ideas about controlling very large mechanical systems. Their feeding strategies have inspired new approaches to sustainable agriculture and resource management. Their social behaviors provide insights into cooperation and coordination in complex systems. Their physiological adaptations offer clues about managing large-scale biological processes. But beyond their practical applications, sauropods represent something even more important. They remind us that the history of life on Earth is filled with wonders that surpass our wildest imagination. They show us that evolution can create solutions to problems we never even thought to ask, and that the natural world contains innovations that continue to challenge our understanding of what's possible. The study of sauropod evolution also provides crucial insights into some of the most fundamental questions in biology and paleontology. How do organisms respond to environmental change? What drives evolutionary innovation? How do complex ecosystems organize themselves? What are the limits of body size and physiological complexity? The answers that sauropods provide to these questions continue to shape our understanding of life itself. Every new fossil discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, revealing new aspects of their biology, behavior, and ecological relationships. Advanced analytical techniques are allowing us to peer deeper into their ancient world than ever before. Computer modeling is helping us understand how these animals actually moved, fed, and interacted with their environment. Biomechanical analyses are revealing the engineering principles behind their incredible adaptations. Geochemical studies are providing insights into their physiology and metabolic processes. The future of sauropod research promises to be just as exciting as its past. New fossil sites are being discovered around the world, each one potentially containing species that could revolutionize our understanding of these ancient giants. Advanced technologies are being developed that will allow us to extract even more information from fossils that have already been collected. Who knows what incredible revelations await us? What new species will be discovered? What new adaptations will be revealed? What new insights into the nature of life itself will these ancient giants provide? The story of sauropod evolution is really the story of life's incredible creativity and resilience. From humble beginnings as small bipedal dinosaurs to their transformation into the largest land animals that have ever existed, sauropods demonstrate that evolution can create wonders beyond our wildest dreams. They show us that life finds a way, no matter how impossible the challenges might seem. They remind us that the natural world is filled with innovations and adaptations that continue to inspire and amaze us. They prove that the history of our planet is far more spectacular and incredible than any work of fiction. The next time you see a tall building or look up at a massive tree, remember that once upon a time our planet was home to living creatures that were just as impressive. Remember that these ancient giants walked the same earth we live on today, breathing the same air, drinking the same water, and experiencing the same sun that we do. Sauropods weren't just big dinosaurs from the distant past. They were proof that evolution can create miracles, that life can overcome any obstacle, and that the natural world contains wonders that will continue to inspire and educate us for generations to come. Their story is our story, a reminder of the incredible journey that life has taken on this planet and the amazing possibilities that still await discovery in the rocks beneath our feet. And here's what absolutely blows my mind about this entire evolutionary journey. We've been talking about these incredible creatures, their mind-boggling adaptations, and their spectacular diversity. But there's one aspect of their story that honestly keeps me up at night thinking about it. The sheer audacity of what evolution accomplished with sauropods goes beyond just creating big animals. No, what happened here was something far more profound and revolutionary. Think about this for a second. Evolution essentially took the basic vertebrate body plan, a design that had been pretty much locked in since the early days of backbone animals, and said, you know what? Let's completely rewrite the rules of what's possible. And that's exactly what happened with sauropods. They didn't just get bigger versions of existing animals. They became something entirely new, something that had never existed before and has never existed since. The engineering solutions they developed weren't just impressive for their time. They were solutions that modern technology is still trying to figure out how to replicate. We're talking about biological systems that were simultaneously more efficient and more robust than anything humans have ever built. These animals were living proof that nature is the ultimate engineer, capable of innovations that make our best technology look primitive by comparison. But here's what really gets me fired up about this whole story. The success of sauropods wasn't just about individual adaptations or clever evolutionary tricks. It was about something much more sophisticated. The emergence of entirely new types of ecological relationships and biological communities that had never existed before on Earth. Before sauropods came along, terrestrial ecosystems were relatively simple affairs. You had your small herbivores, your small carnivores, maybe a few medium-sized animals here and there, but the emergence of giant herbivores completely transformed how life on land worked. Suddenly, ecosystems had to support animals that weighed as much as modern trucks, and that created opportunities and challenges that had never existed before in the history of life. The ripple effects were absolutely incredible. Plants had to evolve new strategies to deal with herbivores that could consume entire trees in a single feeding session. Other animals had to adapt to living in landscapes dominated by creatures that could accidentally step on them without even noticing. Predators had to develop entirely new hunting strategies to deal with prey that was larger than anything that had ever existed. And the sauropods themselves had to figure out how to live in a world where they were simultaneously the dominant force in their ecosystems and completely dependent on maintaining incredibly complex ecological relationships. They had to be ecosystem engineers, environmental managers, and biological architects, all at the same time. The level of ecological sophistication this required is absolutely staggering. These weren't just big animals wandering around eating plants. They were keystone species whose every action shaped the entire structure of their biological communities. When a sauropod herd moved through an area, it didn't just change the vegetation. It changed soil chemistry, water flow patterns, the distribution of other animal species, even the local climate conditions. Recent research has started to reveal just how profound these ecological impacts were. Sauropod feeding activities created mosaic landscapes with patches of different vegetation types, each supporting different communities of smaller animals. Their movement patterns created migration corridors that other species used for thousands of years. Their waste products created nutrient hotspots that supported incredibly diverse plant communities. But what really amazes me is how these effects cascaded through entire ecosystems. The presence of giant herbivores didn't just affect plants directly. It changed the behavior of smaller herbivores, which affected insect communities, which affected pollination patterns, which affected plant reproduction, which came full circle to affect the giant herbivores themselves. We're talking about ecological feedback loops of incredible complexity, where every component of the system was interconnected with every other component in ways that we're still trying to understand. The sauropods weren't just living in these ecosystems. They were actively creating and maintaining them through their daily activities. And this wasn't happening in just one location or during one time period. These complex ecological relationships were developing and evolving over millions of years, across multiple continents, through dramatic environmental changes. The consistency of sauropod ecological dominance across such vast scales of time and space suggests that they had discovered something fundamental about how large terrestrial ecosystems could work. But here's where things get really wild. The ecological relationships that sauropods created weren't just more complex than what had come before. They were more stable and more resilient than most modern ecosystems. These communities persisted for tens of millions of years, surviving climate changes, continental drift, and multiple smaller extinction events. The secret to this stability was probably the incredible diversity of ecological roles that different sauropod species filled. By dividing up resources so precisely, by specializing so completely for different aspects of the herbivore lifestyle, they created ecological communities that were incredibly resistant to disruption. If one type of vegetation became scarce, other sauropod species could shift their feeding strategies to compensate. If environmental conditions changed, different species could take advantage of new opportunities while others retreated to more suitable habitats. The diversity of sauropod adaptations created a biological insurance policy that kept ecosystems functioning even when individual species faced challenges. This kind of ecological engineering is something we see in very few modern animals. Elephants do it to some extent, creating and maintaining savanna ecosystems through their feeding and movement patterns. Beavers are famous for their ecosystem engineering abilities, but neither of these examples comes close to the scale and sophistication of what sauropods accomplished. The closest modern analogy might be human impacts on ecosystems, but even that comparison falls short. Humans change ecosystems primarily through technology and cultural adaptations. Sauropods did it through pure biological innovation, evolving physiological and behavioral adaptations that allowed them to reshape entire landscapes while still maintaining sustainable ecological relationships. And they did all of this while facing some of the most formidable predators that have ever existed. The Mesozoic world wasn't a peaceful place where giant vegetarians could wander around unmolested. These animals were constantly under threat from massive carnivores that had evolved specifically to hunt them. The predator-prey dynamics that emerged from these relationships were absolutely spectacular. We're talking about ecological arms races that pushed both predators and prey to develop increasingly sophisticated adaptations. Sauropods evolved better defenses, predators evolved better hunting strategies, sauropods evolved even better defenses, and so on. The result was an escalation of biological warfare that produced some of the most incredible adaptations we've ever seen. Sauropods with armor plating that could deflect attacks from massive predators. Carnivores with teeth like railroad spikes and jaw muscles that could generate bite forces measured in tons. Herbivores with tails that could break the sound barrier. Predators that hunted in coordinated packs with military-like precision. These weren't just random evolutionary experiments. They were sophisticated solutions to very specific ecological challenges, refined over millions of years of natural selection. Every adaptation was tested against the harsh realities of survival in ecosystems where the stakes couldn't have been higher. But what really impresses me about these predator-prey relationships is how they drove innovation on both sides. The evolution of giant herbivores created opportunities for giant carnivores, which created pressure for even better herbivore defenses, which created opportunities for even more sophisticated predator adaptations. This kind of co-evolutionary feedback loop is one of the most powerful drivers of biological innovation, and the sauropod-predator dynamic was probably one of the most intense examples of it that has ever existed. The result was an ecosystem where both predators and prey were pushed to the absolute limits of what was biologically possible. And somehow, amazingly, this system worked, not just for a few million years, but for over 150 million years, through multiple mass extinction events, through dramatic climate changes, through the complete reorganization of continental positions. The basic sauropod-dominated ecosystem model proved to be one of the most successful and persistent biological communities in the history of life on Earth. The longevity of sauropod success is honestly one of the most impressive aspects of their entire story. Most dominant animal groups last for maybe 10 or 20 million years before being replaced by something else. Sauropods maintained their ecological dominance for more than 7 times that long. They outlasted entire geological periods. They survived the rise and fall of multiple other dinosaur groups. They adapted to environmental changes that would have wiped out less flexible organisms. This kind of long-term evolutionary success requires something special. It's not enough to just be well adapted for current conditions. You need to be adaptable enough to handle whatever changes the future might bring. You need to maintain enough diversity to respond to new challenges. You need to avoid becoming so specialized that you can't adjust to changing circumstances. Sauropods managed to strike this balance perfectly. They were incredibly successful at their chosen lifestyle of giant herbivory, but they maintained enough flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. Different lineages explored different solutions to the same basic challenges, creating a portfolio of adaptations that made the group incredibly resilient. When environmental conditions favored high browsing, the long-necked specialists thrived. When ground-level vegetation became more abundant, the low-browsing specialists took advantage. When predator pressure increased, the armored forms became more successful. When climate conditions changed, different geographic populations could expand or contract their ranges as needed. This kind of adaptive flexibility is incredibly rare in evolutionary history. Most successful groups eventually become so specialized for their particular niche that they lose the ability to respond to major environmental changes. Sauropods somehow manage to avoid this trap, maintaining their ecological dominance while continuously innovating and adapting. But their success wasn't just about biological adaptations. It was also about the cultural and behavioral innovations they developed. The complex social structures, the sophisticated communication systems, the coordinated breeding strategies, the knowledge transfer between generations. All of these cultural adaptations contributed to their long-term success. Recent research has suggested that some sauropod species may have had cultural traditions that were passed down through generations. Knowledge about optimal migration routes, seasonal feeding locations, predator avoidance strategies, and breeding site selection could be transmitted culturally rather than just genetically. This kind of cultural evolution allows much more rapid adaptation to changing conditions than genetic evolution alone. If environmental conditions change, cultural knowledge can be updated within a single generation. If new threats emerge, behavioral responses can be developed and spread through populations much faster than genetic adaptations. The combination of genetic adaptability and cultural flexibility may have been the secret to sauropod success. They had the biological toolkit to handle a wide range of environmental challenges, and they had the behavioral sophistication to rapidly adjust their strategies when conditions changed. But all of this incredible success, all of this evolutionary innovation, all of these sophisticated ecological relationships came to an abrupt end with the asteroid impact that marked the end of the Cretaceous period. The extinction of the sauropods was part of the larger catastrophe that eliminated all non-avian dinosaurs. But it marked the end of one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of life on Earth. The speed and completeness of their extinction makes it even more tragic. These weren't animals that were slowly declining due to gradual environmental changes. They were at the peak of their evolutionary success when the asteroid changed everything in a matter of hours. The last sauropods were still innovating, still adapting, still exploring new ecological niches right up until the very end. The environmental devastation that followed the impact was simply too severe and too rapid for even the most adaptable organisms to survive. The collapse of plant communities eliminated the foundation of the food webs they depended on. The dramatic climate changes exceeded the physiological tolerances of even the most robust species. The breakdown of ecological relationships destroyed the complex biological communities they had spent millions of years creating. Within a few thousand years, an evolutionary experiment that had lasted for over 150 million years was over. The age of giants had ended, and the Earth would never again see terrestrial ecosystems organized around such massive herbivores. The ecological void left by sauropod extinction was enormous and has never been fully filled. Modern ecosystems simply don't have anything comparable to the giant herbivore communities that once dominated terrestrial landscapes. The largest surviving land herbivores are tiny compared to even the smallest sauropods. This absence has had profound effects on how modern ecosystems function. Without giant herbivores to create and maintain large-scale landscape patterns, modern plant communities develop differently than they did during the Mesozoic. Without massive animals to transport nutrients across vast distances, modern biogeochemical cycles operate on much smaller scales. Some researchers have suggested that the loss of sauropods and other megafauna has fundamentally altered how terrestrial ecosystems work. We're living in what they call an empty world, where the absence of very large animals has simplified ecological relationships and reduced the overall complexity of biological communities. But the legacy of sauropods extends far beyond just their ecological role. These animals represent one of evolution's greatest achievements, a demonstration of what's possible when natural selection has the time and opportunity to explore radical new solutions to biological challenges. The innovations they developed continue to inspire modern research and technology. Their bone structures are being studied to develop new lightweight building materials that combine strength with minimal weight. Their respiratory systems are providing insights into more efficient air processing technologies. Their cardiovascular adaptations are informing research into new approaches for managing fluid flow in large-scale systems. Their feeding strategies have implications for sustainable agriculture and resource management. Their social behaviors provide models for cooperation and coordination in complex systems. Their physiological adaptations offer clues about managing large-scale biological processes. But perhaps most importantly, sauropods remind us that the natural world is capable of innovations that surpass our wildest imagination. They show us that evolution can create solutions to problems we never even thought to ask, and that the history of life on Earth contains wonder that continue to challenge our understanding of what's possible. The study of sauropod evolution provides crucial insights into some of the most fundamental questions in biology. How do organisms respond to environmental change? What drives evolutionary innovation? How do complex systems maintain stability while still allowing for adaptation? What are the ultimate limits of biological complexity? Every new fossil discovery adds another piece to this puzzle, revealing new aspects of how these incredible animals lived, evolved, and interacted with their world. Advanced analytical techniques are allowing us to peer deeper into their biology than ever before, while computer modeling is helping us understand how their complex physiological systems actually worked. The future of sauropod research promises to be just as exciting as its past. New fossil sites are being discovered around the world, each one potentially containing species that could revolutionize our understanding of these ancient giants. Emerging technologies will allow us to extract even more information from fossils that have already been collected. What new species await discovery? What new adaptations will be revealed? What new insights into the fundamental nature of life will these ancient giants provide? The answers to these questions will continue to shape our understanding of evolution, ecology, and the incredible potential that exists within the natural world. The story of sauropod evolution is ultimately a story about the incredible creativity and resilience of life itself. From their humble beginnings as small bipedal dinosaurs to their transformation into the largest land animals that have ever existed, sauropods demonstrate that evolution can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and create forms of almost unimaginable complexity and beauty. They show us that life finds a way, no matter how daunting the obstacles might seem. They remind us that the natural world contains innovations and adaptations that continue to inspire and educate us. They prove that the history of our planet is far more spectacular and incredible than any work of science fiction. Sauropods weren't just big dinosaurs from the distant past. They were living proof that evolution can create miracles, that biological systems can achieve levels of sophistication that rival our best technology, and that the natural world contains solutions to problems we're still trying to solve. Their legacy lives on in every new discovery, every new insight, every new application of their biological innovations to modern challenges. They continue to teach us about the fundamental principles of life, evolution, and the incredible possibilities that emerge when natural selection has the time and opportunity to explore radical new approaches to biological design. The next time you marvel at a tall building or look up at a massive tree, remember that once upon a time, our planet was home to living creatures that were just as impressive. Remember that these ancient giants represent one of evolution's greatest success stories, a testament to the incredible journey that life has taken on this planet. And remember that their story is far from over. Every day, researchers around the world are making new discoveries that add new chapters to the sauropod saga. The golden age of understanding these incredible creatures is happening right now, and the revelations that await us promise to be just as spectacular as the animals themselves. The evolution of sauropods stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of life on Earth. A reminder that the natural world is capable of wonders that will continue to inspire and amaze us for generations to come. But here's what honestly gets me the most excited about this entire evolutionary saga, and trust me, this is the part that absolutely blows my mind every single time I think about it. We've covered their incredible journey from tiny bipedal ancestors to walking skyscrapers. We've explored their mind-boggling adaptations and their spectacular diversity. But there's one final aspect of their story that I think perfectly captures just how extraordinary these animals really were. The sheer scale of what sauropods achieved goes beyond just individual biological success. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of what large-scale life on land could look like. For over 150 million years, they maintained dominance over terrestrial ecosystems in ways that no other group of animals has ever managed to replicate. They created biological communities of such complexity and sophistication that modern ecosystems seem almost simple by comparison. Think about the world they inhabited during their peak in the late Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. Picture yourself standing in one of these ancient landscapes, and you're not just looking at a few scattered giant animals. No, you're witnessing entire ecological networks built around dozens of different sauropod species, each one perfectly adapted for its specific role in the community. The high-browsing specialists like Brachiosaurus were essentially living biological skyscrapers, reaching vegetation at heights that created entirely new ecological zones. The ground-level specialists like Nigersaurus were biological lawnmowers, maintaining understory vegetation with surgical precision. The mid-level feeders filled every niche in between, creating a vertical feeding hierarchy that maximized the use of available plant resources. But what really gets me pumped about these ecosystems is how they manage to support such incredible biomass without collapsing under their own weight. We're talking about biological communities where the total mass of herbivorous dinosaurs per square mile was probably higher than anything we see in modern environments. The engineering required to make this work sustainably is absolutely mind-blowing. Different species had evolved feeding strategies so precise that they could coexist without directly competing for resources. Some focused on soft vegetation, others specialized in tough, fibrous material. Some could process massive quantities of low-quality food, while others concentrated on smaller amounts of highly nutritious plants. The level of resource partitioning was so sophisticated that it allowed these ancient ecosystems to support diversity levels that seem almost impossible by modern standards. And the ecological relationships they created weren't just complex, they were incredibly stable. These sauropod-dominated communities persisted through dramatic climate changes, continental drift, and multiple environmental upheavals that would have devastated less robust ecosystems. The secret to their success was the incredible diversity of solutions they had evolved for the same basic challenges. When environmental conditions changed, different lineages could respond in different ways. Some could shift their feeding strategies, others could migrate to more suitable habitats. Still others could adjust their social behaviors to cope with new circumstances. This flexibility created biological communities that were remarkably resilient to disruption. Recent fossil discoveries have revealed evidence of truly massive sauropod congregations, with hundreds or even thousands of individuals gathering at specific locations for breeding, feeding, or seasonal migrations. The logistics of coordinating such enormous gatherings boggle the mind. How do you manage social interactions when individual animals are the size of buildings? How do you coordinate movement when each step covers dozens of feet? The solutions they developed were nothing short of brilliant. Complex communication systems using low-frequency calls that could travel for miles, sophisticated social hierarchies that minimized conflicts within groups, coordinated movement patterns that allowed massive herds to migrate across continents without trampling each other or destroying their own food sources. The breeding colonies they established were probably some of the most spectacular biological events that have ever occurred on Earth. Imagine hundreds of female Titanosaurs, each weighing dozens of tons, carefully coordinating their nesting activities across enormous areas. The level of social organization required for this to work successfully is absolutely staggering. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of sauropod success was their incredible longevity. Most dominant animal groups maintain their ecological supremacy for maybe 10 to 20 million years before being replaced by something else. Sauropods held onto their position for over 150 million years, surviving multiple mass extinction events and adapting to environmental changes that wiped out countless other species. This kind of evolutionary staying power requires something special. It's not enough to just be well adapted for current conditions. You need the flexibility to handle whatever changes the future might bring. You need enough diversity to respond to new challenges. You need to avoid becoming so specialized that you lose the ability to adapt. Sauropods managed this balancing act perfectly. They were incredibly successful at their chosen lifestyle, but they maintained the adaptability to evolve new solutions when circumstances changed. Different lineages explored different approaches to the same basic problems, creating a portfolio of adaptations that made the entire group incredibly resilient. The innovations they developed continue to inspire modern research and technology. Engineers study their bone architecture to create new lightweight construction materials. Computer scientists examine their distributed nervous systems for insights into managing complex networks. Medical researchers investigate their cardiovascular adaptations for applications in treating circulatory diseases. But beyond their practical applications, sauropods represent something even more profound. They demonstrate that evolution can create solutions to seemingly impossible problems and produce forms of beauty and complexity that surpass our wildest imagination. They show us that life is capable of innovations that make our best technology look primitive by comparison. The study of sauropod evolution also provides crucial insights into some of the most fundamental questions about life itself. How do complex systems maintain stability while allowing for continued innovation? What are the ultimate limits of biological complexity? How do organisms respond to environmental changes that threaten their very existence? Every new fossil discovery adds another piece to this incredible puzzle. Advanced imaging techniques are revealing details about their internal anatomy that would have been impossible to study just a few decades ago. Computer modeling is helping us understand how their massive physiological systems actually functioned in living animals. The future of sauropod research promises discoveries that will continue to revolutionize our understanding of these ancient giants. New fossil sites are being explored around the world, each one potentially containing species that could completely change how we think about dinosaur evolution. Emerging technologies will allow us to extract information from fossils that we never dreamed was possible. What new adaptations will be revealed? What new insights into their behavior and ecology will emerge? What new applications of their biological innovations will benefit human technology and medicine? The answers to these questions will continue to shape our understanding of evolution and the incredible potential of life on Earth. But there's something else about sauropods that I find absolutely fascinating, and it has to do with what their extinction means for understanding life on our planet. When that asteroid struck 66 million years ago, it didn't just eliminate individual species. It ended an entire way of organizing terrestrial ecosystems that had been incredibly successful for longer than any other approach to large-scale land-based life. The world we live in today is fundamentally different because sauropods are gone. Modern ecosystems simply don't have anything comparable to the giant herbivore communities that once shaped entire continents. The largest surviving land animals are tiny compared to even the smallest sauropods. And this absence has had profound effects on how biological communities function. Without massive herbivores to create and maintain large-scale landscape patterns, modern plant communities develop very differently than they did during the Mesozoic. Without giant animals to transport nutrients across vast distances, biogeochemical cycles operate on much smaller scales. We're living in what some scientists call an ecologically empty world. where the absence of very large animals has simplified many natural processes. This makes sauropods even more remarkable when you think about it. They weren't just successful animals that happened to go extinct. They represented an entirely different approach to organizing life on land, one that we'll probably never see again. The unique combination of environmental conditions, evolutionary pressures, and biological innovations that made their lifestyle possible was truly a one-time event in Earth's history. Yet their legacy continues to influence our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. The landscapes they shaped, the evolutionary pressures they created, the ecological relationships they established, all of these had cascading effects that influenced the evolution of countless other species, including the lineages that would eventually lead to mammals and ultimately to us. In a very real sense, we are who we are today, partly because of the world that sauropods created and maintained for over 150 million years. The ecosystems they dominated provided the evolutionary context for the development of flowering plants, advanced insect communities, and the early mammalian lineages that would inherit the Earth after the dinosaurs were gone. Understanding sauropod evolution also gives us crucial perspective on our own impact on the planet. Humans are now the dominant force shaping terrestrial ecosystems, much as sauropods once were. But our dominance has lasted for only a few thousand years, while theirs persisted for millions of times longer. What can we learn from their success about creating sustainable relationships with our environment? The answers aren't simple, but they're incredibly important. Sauropods succeeded because they evolved to work with natural systems rather than against them. They became ecosystem engineers who enhanced the complexity and stability of the biological communities they inhabited. Their impact on the environment was enormous, but it was also sustainable over geological timescales. Modern humans, in contrast, often have impacts that simplify rather than enhance ecological complexity. We tend to work against natural systems rather than with them. The challenge for our species is to learn how to be successful ecosystem engineers like the sauropods were, creating positive feedback loops that enhance rather than degrade the biological communities we depend on. This is where the story of sauropod evolution becomes more than just a fascinating chapter in natural history. It becomes a source of inspiration and guidance for how we might create a more sustainable future. These ancient giants show us what's possible when organisms evolve to enhance rather than exploit their environments. But regardless of what lessons we might draw from their success, sauropods will always represent one of evolution's greatest achievements. From tiny bipedal ancestors to walking cathedrals, from simple plant eaters to sophisticated ecosystem architects, they transformed themselves and their world in ways that continue to challenge our understanding of what life can accomplish. Their story is ultimately a celebration of the incredible creativity and resilience of evolution itself. It demonstrates that given enough time and the right conditions, natural selection can produce wonders that surpass anything we can imagine. It shows us that the history of life on Earth is filled with chapters more spectacular than any work of fiction. The next time you look up at a tall building or marvel at a massive tree, remember that once upon a time, our planet was home to living creatures that were just as impressive. Remember that these ancient giants represent proof that evolution can create miracles, that life finds ways to overcome impossible challenges, and that the natural world contains innovations that will continue to inspire us for generations to come. Sauropods weren't just big dinosaurs from the distant past. They were living demonstrations of what's possible when evolution has the freedom to explore radical new approaches to biological design. They were proof that life can create forms of beauty and complexity that rival anything humans have ever built. And their story continues to unfold with every new discovery we make. The golden age of sauropod research is happening right now, with new species being discovered, new adaptations being revealed, and new insights being gained into how these incredible animals lived and thrived. Who knows what amazing revelations await us in the rocks that have yet to be explored? What new species will be found? What new understanding of their biology and behavior will emerge? What new applications of their innovations will benefit human technology and medicine? The answers to these questions promise to be just as spectacular as the animals themselves, because the evolution of sauropods stands as one of the most remarkable success stories in the entire history of life on Earth, a testament to the incredible journey that evolution has taken on our planet, and a reminder that the natural world is capable of wonders that will continue to amaze and inspire us for as long as we have the curiosity to explore them. From their humble beginnings as small two-legged dinosaurs to their transformation into the largest land animals that have ever existed, sauropods show us what's possible when life has the time and opportunity to push the boundaries of biological innovation. They remind us that evolution is the ultimate engineer, capable of creating solutions that make our best technology look primitive by comparison. Their legacy lives on in every fossil we discover, every new insight we gain, and every application of their biological innovations to modern challenges. They continue to teach us about the fundamental principles of life, evolution, and the incredible possibilities that emerge when natural selection has the freedom to explore truly revolutionary approaches to the challenges of existence. The story of sauropod evolution is really the story of life itself, creative, resilient, and constantly pushing the boundaries of what seems possible. These magnificent creatures didn't just happen to get big by accident. They represent one of evolution's greatest masterpieces, a demonstration of what can be achieved when life has the time and opportunity to perfect its craft. And that, honestly, is what makes their story so absolutely incredible. They weren't just successful animals that dominated their world for a while. They were pioneers who showed us what life can accomplish when it's given the chance to dream